Hi, everybody. So we're up to chapter 2 now, and today we're going to be focusing on methods, or the methods that social scientists and, in our case, sociologists use to collect social data. This is a really important chapter, just like the others. It's an important chapter because the information that we have in sociology that you're reading about in this textbook comes from all of the different research studies that have been conducted, all of the different data that's been collected by social scientists in the past. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And this slide just talks about a paradox that we have. And really, a good research project actually, in the end, leaves us with more questions than we than answers, and it leaves us with more questions than what we came in with. And this is really how you should think about the class too. Um, a mark of a successful class is if students have more questions than answers when they finish that class. And it's largely because the more that you know, the more you realize there's so much out there that you don't know. And that's kind of how it is with research too. If we have a really good research study and we can collect really good data and we have a good analysis and good findings, but in the end we're like, oh wow, this opened up all these other horizons, based on the findings that we have now. So let's do this in a future study. Okay, so that's what it's all about as far as this paradox. So research methods, that sounds a bit dry, right? But I'm going to give you some very concrete examples about what we mean by that. So this is simply the methods by which we collect data, kind of the set of rules that we use in the social sciences. And in the social sciences, we use the scientific method. And the scientific method is something you probably learned in junior high, right? And it goes to hypothesis testing, gathering of data, analyzing evidence, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to talk about today as well. And in the social sciences and in sociology, we have methods that you could call quantitative methods and methods that you could call qualitative. And they're both very important, and they actually kind of complement each other. So I'm going to give you an example of this. So again, quantitative methods are methods that seek to have large scale data being collected that's more numeric in form. Okay, so quantitative methods are usually survey based and collect data from a very large number of people, and then that data can be quantified and can be converted to numeric form. Qualitative methods are very different, but let me give you an example of a quantitative method. So the National Crime Victimization Survey is a very important quantitative survey, quantitative type of method that is used by the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the federal government. And every year, more than 100,000 people are randomly selected by researchers at the Bureau of Justice Statistics to take and complete this survey. And it is about a 2 hour long questionnaire, and it is very complicated. So with the assistance of a research assistant, um, the respondents answer these questions. And basically, the National Crime Victimization Survey asks these people, had they been a victim of a crime in the last year? Um, and this could be anything from a violent crime to a property crime. And there are more than 100 different questions. And so it's very detailed, it's very specific, it lets us have very important information. Um, and this is how we know a lot about trends in crime rates in the US. So that is a quantitative style type of method. And just to give you a little bit of added information, the other way that we know a lot about crime statistics in the US is through the uniform crime reports that the FBI collects. And they collect that from the various police departments around the country that report on reported crimes. Okay, so there's two different ways. You have agency data on reported crimes, and you have the National Crime Victimization Survey. And the National Crime Victimization Survey is very important because a lot of crimes are never reported to the police, right? Okay, so that's an example of a quantitative type of method. But say you're really interested in criminal justice or social work, anything that has to do with kind of victims, and but you're not really inclined to do a large scale study. You don't have the resources like the federal government. And this example that I'm going to be using here is actually one from my colleague who teaches at California State in Sacramento. She was very interested and did in the process of how victims forgave their victimizers, and if they did, and if they did, how it worked. And so qualitative methods are not statistical. They surround the analysis of stories, the analysis of words, the analysis of narratives. And qualitative methods tend to be more specific um, and smaller scale studies. But of course, they can complement these broader studies like the National Crime Victimization Survey. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about qualitative methods with that particular study in just a second. So here, this is the interview with Dana Boyd that is detailed very much in the textbook. So I won't go into that at all. This is something that you can do on your own time with the textbook. Okay. So let's talk about the different approaches to doing research. So you've probably heard of the term deductive before, or deducing. So the deductive approach begins with a theory. Okay, and again, if you remember from last time, a theory is very different than a hypothesis. A theory is an overall theoretical framework or framework that allows us to really know how to go about the research process. It informs how the research is framed. It informs what types of questions that we should or could be asking, okay? So theory is the overall framework, the overall body of existing knowledge that is out there on a specific topic that helps frame or form our research question and our research process, okay? So again, a hypothesis, that is a very different thing. That's much more specific than a theory. A hypothesis is a prediction based upon existing information or existing knowledge. Okay? So then you make your empirical observations, you collect data. Empirical is just another term for scientific. And then you analyze the data, and then you report that. Okay? So the deductive approach is very similar, if not this is exact same as the basic scientific method. Okay? So the inductive approach, though, is very different. The inductive approach, you don't start with this overarching framework, okay? You start with the actual observations, and then from the observations or the data that you collect, out of that comes a kind of a conceptual framework that eventually becomes more of a theory. Okay? So let me give you this example here with going back to my colleague in California. So believe it or not too many people had ever conducted a study like that. It was a little bit surprising. Inductive approaches work better when there isn't a lot of existing literature on that particular topic. So you don't really have very much a theory that can inform how you go about setting up the study. So with the case of my colleague, no one had ever really studied this in depth, at least in sociology, about how do victims go about forgiveness, if they go about it at all, and how does that then improve or not improve their mental well-being. Okay, so what she did in this study, which was very qualitative in nature, was she got the permission to observe and spend time, an entire year, with women at a domestic violence shelter. And from there, She got to learn about the people's experiences just by observing, interacting very casually, more informally with them at first. And then after she gained the trust of the people in the shelter, she did in-depth interviews with them, and that became her social data. Okay. So in sociology, like all their social sciences, we cannot always prove causation, um, but that is still the goal. Okay, so causation is very different than correlation, and I think you have probably heard this before. The difference between causation and correlation, and correlation is simply a relationship or an association between two factors or two variables. There are two variables that kind of move together. And so, what we see in the US is we see a high correlation, for example, between the education level of someone, of an individual, and their income. Okay? But if we just test those two variables, we can only, from that process, state that we have a correlation. Causation requires two added things to this. It needs time order and statistical control. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in the next slide here. So let's go to this next slide, which talks about different levels of variables. Okay, so we have here an independent and a dependent variable. So a dependent variable is the variable that is really the effect, okay? The independent variable is exerting the influence on the independent variable. The independent variable is the causal variable, whereas the dependent variable is affected by the independent variable. Okay, so in our case here, at the Moving to Opportunity study, what was the dependent variable, right? The dependent variable was the outcomes, the student outcomes, right? The independent variable was moving to opportunity, right? The neighborhood type, the neighborhood that these families were moving into, and plus, in the schools on top of that, right? But the schools were a part of the neighborhood, okay? So an independent variable is the causal variable. And to remember this, you can just have some easy tricks, right? So the dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable, right? And also just think of what it means to be independent, right? To be an independent person. To be an independent person means that you have some control over your own life. You can exert influence on your own life, right? So think about that with the independent variable. It's the influential variable. Okay, and then of course we have our hypothesis. So in that study, the Moving to Opportunity study, their hypothesis was if children from low-income families are moved, and of course their families too, if those families are moved to mixed income or middle class communities where they can attend middle class schools with greater levels of teacher and parental and community resources, then they will achieve more in school and achieve more in their financial life and professional life in the future. So hypotheses tend to be stated in an if-then format. If this happens, then this will occur. Okay? So what makes for good research? Okay? What makes for good research? So research should be what's called valid, reliable, and generalizable. Okay? So let's talk about what some of these terms mean. Validity really means is what we're measuring is how is this really measuring the concept? Okay, does the study really measure what it's intended to measure? And you've heard of the term valid before. Valid kind of means is it true? Is it authentic? Right? Like is this a valid argument? right? So in this case, um, moving to opportunity, is it measuring what it's intended to measure? And this study has been conducted for over 20 years. And the longer that we are collecting data on, that sociologists are collecting data from the study, the more authentic and valid it seems to be. Okay. Um, Another way of looking at this was going back to the crime issue. So let's take one measure of crime, homicide. Is homicide a good measure or a valid measure of overall violent crime? And yes, it's fairly good, but it's incomplete, right? Why is it incomplete? It's incomplete because if you're just measuring homicide, you're leaving out many other factors, correct? You're leaving out aggravated assault, robbery, rape, and other types of violent crimes. So we also want our measures to be very inclusive of the entire concept. Okay. So are our measures reliable? And think about what reliability means, right? So reliability in research means will we get consistency? Will we get consistent results over time? And think about what it means to just, have a reliable car or a reliable friend, right? So a reliable car means that it'll do what it's expected to do every day. When you turn the ignition switch, it turns on, it gets you to your job or to the store the way it's supposed to. Or a reliable friend means someone who is um, consistent, someone you can count on, someone you can trust to do what you think needs to be done, and what you expect of them. So it's the same with social research. So the important thing here, though, is reliability. You can have reliability without having validity, or at least good validity. So let's take education again. Let's take SAT scores. So SAT scores, you might take that over and over again and get the same result. That would sort of mean that it's a reliable test. It's a reliable test in measuring your academic aptitude, right? If you get the same score, or close to the same score, the 3 times you take the SAT. But is the SAT test a valid measure of academic aptitude, right? So, and some people would say yes, some people would say no. In some ways, it is, right? Because your SAT is still measuring your quantitative ability, quantitative analytical skills, your research, your reading and writing ability to some extent, right? But it's also very artificial, right? Testing in general can be artificial, and then especially a standardized test with time limits, right? So there should be other measures, right, for academic aptitude than just SAT scores. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. And then finally, with generalizability, this means is what occurring in from this case that we studied, can this be applied to other groups, to other populations? So with going back to the Moving to Opportunity study, what they found amongst these 800 families across 6 different metropolitan areas is, they found that the kids, their schooling dramatically improved, and their test scores, graduation rates, entrance to colleges dramatically improved when they were moved to middle-income communities with middle-income public schools. And it also showed the parents did better too. The parents had better mental health, less stress. They tended to have slightly better paying jobs. And so we found these really interesting results. But can these results apply to other, families who in the future maybe will be moved to other, to middle class communities? So originally the study did want to expand to far more than 800 families and far more than 6 cities. They wanted to do a nationwide study with thousands of families who were in this experiment. However, political pressure unfortunately caused them to not expand. They were not able to expand the study. Okay, so we talked a little bit about theory last time, and theory that improved. That definitely informed the research for the moving to opportunity study, right? You can kind of think of the moving to opportunity study as being based in conflict theory. Remember? So conflict theory discusses how social inequality um, can, especially economic inequality, can contribute to significant societal problems. That's kind of the core of conflict theory, um, and that inequality can cause conflict. And so that informed the move into opportunity study, right? Because you have all this educational inequality amongst kids and what they experience. So the conflict approach, the conflict methodology really informed the move into opportunity study. Whereas the feminist theory, feminist methodology is different. But, and I'm going to give you an example here that will, I think, help you um, understand feminist methodology a little bit better. Feminist methodology focuses, of course, on issues that really impact women to a larger extent. Okay, so let me give you an example here of how women experience home life differently and the work life differently, and then how that impacts their life outcomes. So I'm sure all of you are kind of aware that the family work falls on women, okay? Falls much more heavily on women and mothers than it does on men and fathers and husbands, right? The family work, including childcare, including um, taking time to take care of sick children, taking time off from work to care for uh, sick or elderly family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, um, grandparents. Okay, and so research it clearly shows that women earn less money than men. Now, the income and wage gap has narrowed considerably, but men and women still um, still have quite a bit of inequality as far as wages. Women earn about 80 cents to the dollar, okay, for a man. And one of the reasons that women have lower incomes is because of this family work, right? So when people become pregnant, when couples become pregnant, it's usually the woman, right? It's usually the mother who will take time off from work during the pregnancy, or and then especially after the child is born, and for up to maybe for many as long as a month to 5 years or longer, right? And those work interruptions caused by pregnancy negatively impact women's income, right? Because they take time out of the workforce to take care of the baby, to take care of the child. And because they're out of the workforce, their work history is interrupted, their work experience is interrupted. They may have to leave a job for a while or completely, and then so they miss uh, opportunities for promotion, right, for upward advancement in those companies or organizations. So that's key. And another reason that pertains to the fact that women often have to do the majority of family work and home care work is women will often take lower paying jobs than what they're qualified for based upon their experience and education, because that lower paying job might offer more flexibility. Okay, it might offer more flexibility so they can be at home when the kids come home, so they can be more of a daycare provider, take care of their aging parents, whatever, right? There's a lot of different reasons why a flexible work schedule would be easier on family life. So first, though, women are more likely to take time off for pregnancy, childbirth, plus they're more likely to take lower paying jobs because their work is more flexible. So what this does during the entire, careers is that by the time women are retired, are in the retirement age, they have far less social security than men would, than their husbands would. Their social security payments are far less. And this is particularly troubling if they're divorced, if they get a divorce, right? Their social security retirement will be far less um, generous than had they had been in a higher paying job their entire lives and had they not taken time off from work, right? Or a large periods of their life were not in the workforce. And then, of course, their private retirement accounts would be far likely to have high levels of money in them as well, right? So both Social Security and their private, like 401k or retirement um, system, would also have a lot less money in it as well. Okay, and not getting into too much detail, with these women who also take lower paying jobs because they offer more flexibility for their families, those are the types of jobs that are not as likely to offer any type of retirement account, like a 401k, especially a matching account, or when the company or organization puts money into your retirement, even if you don't. Okay, so that would be a type of study, an issue that follows the feminist methodology. Okay, so this slide talks about the different types of really research, the different types of research methods that social scientists and sociologists employ. Okay, and I myself have engaged in quite a few of these different methods. So let's talk about a few here. So participant observation. This would fall much more heavily under qualitative research rather than quantitative research. Participant observation is when you immerse yourself in a social setting. You get to know the people, you get to gain the trust of the people. So you're participating in that social environment. They know that you're there observing them and researching them. And from these observations and interactions, you can collect a lot of data. And this is what my colleague did in California when she observed, women's shelters, uh, women's shelters for domestic violence victims. She spent a year there, and she got to know, all of the women in that shelter and was able to gain the trust of them. And then later on, did formal interviews with them that lasted, from anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. I've done participant observation and interviews as well for different studies that I've been engaged in. So one of my latest studies that I did in New York before I moved to North Carolina was I looked at families who had decided to stay in urban public schools. These were largely upper middle class professionals, and they had the resources to move to suburban public schools or to send their kids to private schools. But they had decided that they were going to stick to the city schools, the city public schools, despite the fact that there were a lot of challenges in these city public schools. And so for this project, I observed PTA meetings, I observed school board meetings, and I was able to then meet people from engaging in these and observing these meetings that I then later interviewed. And the interviews, again, like my colleagues, lasted from anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. And I interviewed about 50 people, about 50 parents. And it took a year just to collect interviews from 50 parents because it would take like 2 weeks just to set up one interview, because these people are busy. So this participant observation and interviewing is very intensive. It's very time intensive. Okay. So survey research, of course, that was, this is actually the most common type of research done in sociology, as well as other social sciences like economics and political science. And the National Crime Victimization Survey would be a really good example of that. Surveys are better if you have more of a deductive type of question and when you want a lot of descriptive data from a large group of people. Okay, so that's why the National Crime Victimization Survey. That's why it's set up as a survey. They want basic descriptive data, like what kind of crimes did you observe, or what kind of crimes were you a victim to, if at all, in 2019. Uh, and so it's very descriptive. It doesn't really go into in depth like an observation or in-depth interview would, but it's very good information just for quantitative purposes on the types of crimes that were committed in these particular communities and who the victims were. Okay? So comparative research, this is also very important. Comparative research is also done in history, as well as historical methods, of course, are conducted in the field of history. But in comparative research, as far as sociology, how comparative research is really set up is you would look at 2 or 3 specific cases, and the 2 or 3 cases would all be similar except for one important distinction. And the job of the researcher is to figure out, okay, these cases are all similar except for this one factor in this one case. What made that one case special? Okay, so let me give you a quick example of this. So the United States is really the only major democracy around the world that does not have a Labor Party. Okay, and maybe you haven't even heard of a Labor Party. Most countries have Labor Parties. Most democracies. A Labor Party is a party that was formed out of the interests of the working class, mainly from people who were in the trades, um, the trade union movement and the labor movement. So Great Britain, Germany, Canada, France, Australia, Italy, they all have strong labor parties. But the US has never had a labor party. And so the job of sociologists would be to try to find out and figure out, okay, why did a labor party never develop in the United States? Okay? Where it did with all these other similar countries. There are also, democracies and also fairly economically advanced. Okay, um, I'm just going to go through experimentation really quickly because that is something that we don't do a whole lot in sociology. Experiments are more important in the medical sciences as well as in psychology. But the basic point of an experiment is to really pinpoint causation because you have 2 groups that are similar in every respect, except one group, the research or experimental group, gets a treatment, and then one group does not. And that's called the control group or the placebo group. Okay? So an experiment, what you do is you recruit similar types of people who are similar in every regard. Okay? And then one group gets a treatment, one group doesn't. So it's a very good at isolating causation. Okay? So I'm sure you can better understand that with a medical like drug or something, but it is sometimes done in sociology. You can take a very, very similar group of students, for example, put half of the class in a special intensive tutoring session. The other half of the class gets nothing, and you can see the results. Like if the class that got the treatment, or the half of the class that got the treatment, the extra tutoring services, whether they did better, okay, whether they did better on their final exam or their final overall course grade than the group that didn't get the extra tutoring or the tutoring at all. Okay, so that's an experiment. Um, Historical methods, and I'll go back to content analysis, but historical methods, we use this in sociology too. Historical methods are usually the analysis of archival data, okay? Archival data, all right? So let's go back to content analysis though, because this is more common. So content analysis, and Dalton Conley does a pretty good job of discussing this in the textbook, but content analysis is the critical analysis of different types of texts. And you can think of texts in a very wide, inclusive fashion. Texts can be anything from um, movie, movies, to song lyrics, to newspaper articles, to television programming, to um, diary entries or journal entries or letters, anything that has a message component to it. Artwork can even be considered a text. Okay, so content analysis is really important when we're trying to kind of study culture. Okay, if we're very interested in looking at cultural change, it might be a good idea to study the texts that those cultures produce. Okay, so let me give you an example. Say we're very interested in looking at how like Asian people were portrayed in Hollywood in the 1980s compared to today. And so in the 1980s, you might know that Asian people were depicted in very stereotypical ways, especially if they were Chinese. And in fact, that was like the that was China was the entire that's what we thought all of Asia was, right? So they were considered the prototypical Asian, even though there are dozens of other countries in Asia. So what you might do is you might take a look at 24 films in the 1980s and how they portray Asians, and then look at 24 films in the 2000s and how they portray Asians. And the same could be with how are Black people portrayed on television or in film or in newspaper articles or in magazines, right? In the 1980s or the 1990s versus today. So this can be done for anything. Say you might be interested in looking at how soldiers perceive war. And then, so you might analyze letters that soldiers wrote in the 1970s versus letters or social media posts that soldiers um, wrote during the Iraq War or Afghanistan War, to see if there's similarities or differences. Okay? So that's what content analysis is. It gives us a very important insight into um, how the culture is during that time period, and then how that culture can shape public opinion and public moods and public sentiments. Let me just give you one more example of that. So you can maybe look at how, say you're interested in sexuality, gender, all that kind of stuff, and you might compare, how were gay people portrayed in movies or television in the 1980s, and how are gay people portrayed today? And the research that has been done on this suggests that in the 1980s, gay people were often portrayed as being predatorial, as being predators. And that certainly is not the case today. And that's changed with a lot of different movies, and it's changed with television, especially Will and Grace and Ellen. Okay, so I hope that gives you an understanding of content analysis and why it's important. Okay, it's same with Duncan Watts. You can look at that on your own time. We're going to end up looking at ethics in research and as well as policies and the impact on policies. So every profession has ethical standards and ethical rules, and social scientists and sociologists also must abide by these. Okay, and there are a few different types of ethical rules that we're going to talk about. The main one is informed consent. Okay, what informed consent means is that the people understand what they're getting into. Okay, the people whom you're researching, collecting data from, kind of understand what they're getting into. They understand the purpose of the study, the research question, what's going to happen to them, what kind of data is going to be collected, how is the data going to be used, how is the data going to be protected and maintained private, okay, for privacy issues. So that's what informed consent is. And if you've ever signed a consent form, that's sort of what an informed consent on a research project looks like as well. So informed consent is the key that holds everything together in ethical conduct of social research. But other ethical rules are that the research must not invade their privacy. It must not harm them, either psychologically or physically. And that in almost all cases, try to avoid deception, if at all possible. Now, deception is sometimes required, especially in psychology. Psychologists often do what are called simulations, and they try to alter people's behavior. And so if the subjects or participants know what the study is about prior to engaging in the simulation, then this would wreck the study. It would alter their behavior. So that is why deception is sometimes used, because if the participants are in full knowledge of what the research is about, it could impact their responses. So social scientists generally think that deception is not bad if it does not harm the participants in any way, either psychologically or physically. And this is very important, at the end you have to engage in full disclosure. So at the end of the study, after you collect the data from the participant or subject, you would then have to tell them, okay, we lied to you. This is what we were really trying to do, but we had to lie to you, kind of trick you, or else you would have played along. Okay. So as long as there's full disclosure at the end about the true purpose of the study and why they had to go through that process, then it's fine. Okay, and then finally and lastly, what do we do with the sociological research that we collect and that we analyze and then publish? And so most sociologists are interested in social improvement and making the society better for people. And luckily, a lot of sociological research has informed policymakers, not necessarily at the federal level all the time, but policymakers in local organizations and local communities at state level, and of course even at the federal level. And not just for government, but also for how private organizations operate. A research study might show, for instance, that a family therapy practice is not really effective, for this counseling organization or this hospital, right? So it doesn't have to be public policy. Research can inform private practitioners as well, okay? And let me just finish with this, because we talked a lot about education today. So Coleman researched poverty in schools and poverty in families in the 1960s. And his research helped the creation of Head Start. Okay, and Head Start, of course, I'm sure most of you or all of you have heard of Head Start. Head Start is the early childhood education program that some low-income students are fortunate enough to get into. And Head Start is widely considered to be amongst the most effective government programs that have ever, that has ever been devised. And Head Start has been shown to dramatically improve the academic performance and then later life success for the kids who were in Head Start. And we know this because we've tracked some of these original kids who were in Head Start in the 1960s. And we looked at how Head Start improved their life outcomes in comparison to kids who did not have Head Start, in comparison to kids who were not able to get into early childhood education programs with a high quality type of content that Head Start had. Now, unfortunately, most kids who are poor are ineligible for Head Start, or not ineligible, but there's just not enough Head Start money in the Head Start programs. So only less than a third of poor children actually get Head Start. Okay, so that's a really interesting and a very powerful finding, and it was social research that helped inform the creation of Head Start. Now, of course, it took governors and the president and Congress to enact these things, but it was informed and it came out of research. Okay, so that is it for today. I hope these slides were helpful. Let me know in the email if you have any questions. Be happy to help you with anything regarding um, the information in this slideshow.